Welcome to In the Know News, where we break down the stories that matter most. Today we're asking, why are countries ignoring Ukraine's plea for help? Let's dive into this critical issue.
All right, so you're probably wondering about this whole Ukraine thing. Like, why are so many countries hesitant to, fully back Ukraine against Russia?
Right. It's a really good question.
It's something we've been hearing a lot about. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are kind of struggling with it, especially when you see, like, global condemnation of the invasion.
Yeah.
But then there's not a lot of impactful action. You know what I mean? So we're going to do a deep dive today and try to figure it out.
Yeah, let's untangle this knot.
Using some expert insights and research to kind of shed light on this whole complex geopolitical puzzle.
It is fascinating, isn't it? You'd think that with such widespread condemnation of Russia's action,
Oh, yeah.
you'd see a more unified and forceful response.
Right.
But it's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
So we've got reports from the Pew Research Center, we've got articles analyzing specific countries' stances, and we've got some academic papers that explore the concept of neutrality in the modern world.
Okay.
All of these paint a picture that's far from a simple good versus evil narrative.
All right, so let's get into it. One of the sources that we have is an analysis of why even democratic nations, who often talk about freedom and self-determination, they seem to be holding back a bit. What's going on there?
Well, it's tempting to think that democracies would be on the front lines, fully supporting another democracy under attack. But a lot of them are walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
And it's not just about internal politics either. A lot of these countries have historical baggage that plays a huge role. Germany, for instance. Germany has a particularly complex relationship with this conflict.
He's of World War II.
Exactly. Germany's historical responsibility for the devastation of World War II, it weighs very heavily on their current foreign policy decisions.
Yeah.
Sending lethal aid to a conflict zone, especially one where they had a significant military presence during the war.
Right.
That's a sensitive issue that sparks intense internal debate.
So it's not just about avoiding repeating past mistakes, but also about navigating the perceptions and sensitivities that are tied to that history.
Exactly. There are concerns about how these actions would be perceived, not just domestically, but also by neighboring countries. A lot of these countries still bear the scars of that war. And this is where we see the concept of realpolitik come into play.
Realpolitik, for those of us who might not be political science experts.
Good point. Realpolitik is essentially the idea of prioritizing national interests. Pragmatic national interests above ethical considerations or ideological commitments, making decisions based on what's best for your nation's security and power, even if it means compromising on certain values or principles.
Got it. So in Germany's case, realpolitik means considering the potential backlash from its own people and its neighbors, even if it means holding back on support for Ukraine.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But Germany's not alone in this. India, for example. India relies heavily on Russia for military equipment. Cutting off that relationship to support Ukraine would directly undermine their own national security. It's a tough position to be in.
It's interesting how these historical ties and realpolitik calculations, they can sometimes lead to strange bedfellows. We've got another example here, Israel. Their need for Russia's cooperation in Syria, particularly in managing the situation with Iranian-backed forces, makes it difficult to openly condemn Russia.
For sure. It highlights how interconnected global politics truly is. One country's foreign policy decision can have ripple effects across continents and create these really complex webs of interdependence.
Almost like a giant chess game. Every move's carefully calculated to protect one's own interests, while anticipating the opponent's next move.
That's a good analogy. And on this chessboard, economic ties are some of the most powerful pieces. Let's look at Germany again, their dependence on Russian gas, especially with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, made taking a strong stance against Russia economically risky.
So it's not just about weapons and military aid, but also about the flow of essential resources like energy.
Absolutely. And this economic vulnerability isn't unique to Germany either. Several African nations rely heavily on Russia for grain imports and fertilizer. Opposing Moscow could jeopardize their access to these crucial resources, and that puts their food security and economic stability at risk.
So for these countries, the immediate needs of their people, like making sure there's food on the table, outweighs the pressure to take sides in a conflict that feels very geographically distant.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
For many nations, especially in the developing world. The economic ramifications of choosing a side in this conflict are just too high.
Right.
They're forced to prioritize their own survival and stability over taking a moral stand.
But it's not always about being forced into a corner. Our sources also highlight how some countries choose neutrality as a deliberate strategy. They're not being bullied, they're playing their own game.
Right. It's about navigating the complexities of global power dynamics without being pulled into a conflict that doesn't directly impact them.
Okay.
Think of it as a way to maintain foreign policy autonomy and potentially even position themselves as mediators in the future. It's a bit like the non-alignment movement from the Cold War era, a way for countries to chart their own course amidst the superpowers' tug of war.
So playing Switzerland, essentially.
Yeah.
Staying neutral and potentially benefiting from both sides.
Well, not always about benefiting, more like not becoming collateral damage. Take South Africa, for example. Their president has explicitly stated a desire to talk to both Russia and Ukraine, emphasizing diplomacy and mediation.
That makes sense, given their history of apartheid, and the role international pressure played in ending it. They might be particularly attuned to the downsides of global isolation.
Exactly. It's informed their approach to international relations, favoring dialogue and understanding over hardline stances.
But isn't this neutrality kind of a gamble? What if one side sees it as weakness or a lack of commitment?
It is a calculated risk,
Yeah.
no doubt. But for some nations, it's the best way to maintain their independence and avoid being drawn into a conflict that doesn't align with their immediate national interests.
And then you have countries like India, who seem to be playing a different game altogether. They're maintaining strong relationships with both Russia and the West.
India. The masters of strategic ambiguity.
Right.
They're essentially hedging their bets. In a world where global power dynamics are in constant flux, it's about keeping their options open and not alienating any major players on the world stage.
So while some countries are choosing sides, or at least leaning heavily in one direction, others are deliberately keeping their cards close to their chest, waiting to see how the game unfolds.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us to another major player who's adopted a similar approach.
China. China's position has been really interesting. They haven't openly supported the invasion, but they haven't condemned it either. And they've definitely been cozying up to Russia economically.
China's walking a very fine line. On one hand, they have a strategic partnership with Russia, a shared interest in challenging the Western-led world order. On the other hand, they don't want to alienate their trading partners in the West or face potential economic repercussions.
So it's a delicate balancing act. But could this situation actually benefit China in the long run?
It certainly presents an opportunity for them to strengthen their global influence. As the West focuses on supporting Ukraine, China can use this time to bolster ties with Russia, expand its economic footprint in developing nations, and position itself as a leader in a potentially multipolar world.
It's almost like the tectonic plates of global power are shifting right beneath our feet.
That's a powerful image, and a fitting one. The war in Ukraine is not just a regional conflict, it's a catalyst for a broader geopolitical realignment. And as these power dynamics shift, it's not just China that stands to gain.
Our research indicates that countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa could also leverage this situation to enhance their own positions on the world stage.
Precisely. They can leverage their non-alignment, their strategic partnerships, and their growing economic clout to assert themselves as major players in this evolving global order.
As you're describing all of this, someone listening might be wondering, what does this all mean for me?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? We often think of geopolitics as something distant and abstract, a game played by diplomats and politicians in faraway capitals. But the reality is that these global shifts have very real, tangible consequences for all of us.
It affects our economies, our security, even our daily lives.
Absolutely. The price of gas at the pump, the availability of certain goods, the stability of our financial markets, all of these can be influenced by the geopolitical currents swirling around us.
So staying informed and engaged isn't just a matter of intellectual curiosity. It's about understanding the forces that are shaping our world and being prepared for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers, we're all participants in this complex global system. And the choices we make, both individually and collectively, will determine the course of this unfolding drama.
It's both exhilarating and a little bit terrifying, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But that's the nature of living in a world that's constantly evolving.
Well, before we get too caught up in the grand sweep of history, let's bring it back to the issue at hand. We've been diving deep into why many countries are hesitant to go all in on supporting Ukraine against Russia. And we've uncovered a complex web of factors. Historical baggage, the polar realpolitik, economic ties, the strategic appeal of neutrality. It's a lot to process.
It is, and it all points to one key takeaway. Public condemnation doesn't always translate into concrete action.
Right.
There's often a huge gap between words and deeds on the world stage, and that gap is usually filled with a mix of self-interest, strategic calculations, and sometimes a good dose of historical baggage.
So how do we make sense of all this? How do we as individuals even begin to navigate this incredibly complex landscape?
Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge that complexity. We need to move beyond these simplistic narratives of good guys and bad guys and recognize that every nation is acting in what it perceives to be its own best interests.
Oh, yep.
And those interests are often shaped by factors that go far beyond the immediate crisis at hand.
It's about understanding the context, the history, the economic and political pressures that are influencing these decisions.
Exactly. And once we start to see things from multiple perspectives, we can begin to appreciate the challenges these countries face, even if we don't agree with their choices.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating empathy, not just for the people directly affected by the conflict, but also for those who are struggling to find their footing in this shifting global landscape.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this conversation? What's the most important insight they can carry with them?
I think it's the realization that the world is in a state of flux. The old rules are being rewritten, and the balance of power is shifting. We can't afford to be complacent or cling to outdated assumptions. We need to stay informed, be critical in our thinking,
Right.
and be open to understanding different perspectives.
It's about embracing nuance, questioning our own biases, and recognizing that there's always more to learn.
You put it perfectly. And remember, this isn't just a spectator sport. We're all participants in this global drama, whether we realize it or not.
Right.
The choices made by our leaders, by businesses, by individuals, all contribute to shaping the world we live in.
So stay engaged, stay curious, and keep asking those tough questions.
And perhaps most importantly, stay hopeful. Even in these uncertain times, there's always room for dialogue, for understanding, and for building a more peaceful and just world.
That's a message I think we can all get behind. This has been quite a deep dive, wouldn't you say? We've explored the complexities of the global response to the war in Ukraine, uncovered some surprising motivations, and hopefully challenged a few assumptions along the way.
We've only just scratched the surface, really. There's always more to uncover, more to learn, more to discuss.
That's the beauty of it all, isn't it?
Oh.
The world is an endlessly fascinating place, full of contradictions and complexities. And as we continue to learn and grow, we can hopefully contribute to making it a better, more understanding place.
I couldn't agree more.
That's our deep dive for today. We hope you found it enlightening, and maybe even a little bit empowering. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. So we've talked about historical baggage, we've talked about realpolitik, economic ties, and this strategic appeal of neutrality. It's kind of a lot.
It is. It really is. And it all kind of points back to this idea that condemnation doesn't always equal action.
Right.
Like public condemnation, it doesn't always translate into something concrete.
Yeah.
There's this gap between what people say and what they do, especially on the world stage. And that gap, it's usually filled with self-interest and strategy, and, sometimes a bit of historical baggage, too.
So how can we make sense of this? Like, how do we as individuals even begin to navigate this incredibly complex landscape?
I think the first step is to acknowledge the complexity. We have to move beyond this simple idea of good guys and bad guys and recognize that every nation, they're all acting in what they think are their own best interests.
Yep.
And those interests are often shaped by factors that go way beyond the immediate crisis.
So understanding the context,
Yeah.
the history, the economic and political pressures.
Exactly. And once we start seeing things from these multiple perspectives, we can start to appreciate the challenges these countries face, even if we don't always agree with their choices. It's about cultivating empathy, not just for the people directly affected by the conflict, but also for those who are trying to figure out where they stand in the shifting global landscape.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest thing is realizing that the world is changing. The rules are being rewritten. The balance of power is shifting. And we can't just sit back and watch. We have to stay informed, think critically, and be open to understanding different points of view.
So embrace the nuance, question your own biases, and realize there's always more to learn.
Perfectly said. And another thing, this isn't just something happening to us. We're all part of this. Whether we realize it or not,
Yeah.
the choices our leaders make, businesses, individuals, all of it shapes the world we live in.
So stay engaged. Stay curious. Keep asking those tough questions.
And you know what else? Stay hopeful. Even in these crazy times, there's always room for dialogue, for understanding, for building a better world.
I think we can all agree on that. This has been a pretty intense deep dive. We've explored the global response to the war in Ukraine, found some surprising motivations, and hopefully challenged a few assumptions.
Absolutely. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's always more to learn, more to discuss.
That's the beauty of it all, right? The world's a fascinating place. It's full of contradictions, complexities,
Yeah.
and hopefully as we learn and grow, we can all help make it a better, more understanding place.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, that's it for today. We hope you found it enlightening, maybe even empowering. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning,
Yeah.
and keep diving deep.
Thank you for joining us on In the Know News, where we explore the stories shaping our world. Ukraine's struggle calls on us all to stay informed, ask questions, and hold leaders accountable. If you found this episode insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more global coverage. Stay engaged, stay aware, and stand in solidarity. Until next time.